Chapter 30. And Moses spake unto the heads of the tribes concerning the children of Israel, saying, This is the thing which the Lord hath commanded. If a man vow a vow unto the Lord, or swear an oath to bind his soul with a bond, he shall not break his word, he shall do according to all that proceedeth out of his mouth. If a woman also vow a vow unto the Lord, and bind herself by a bond, being in her father's house in her youth, and her father hear her vow, or rather hear of her vow. It doesn't have to be as displayed right here, but once that her father hears of her vow, and her bond wherewith she hath bound her soul, and her father shall hold his peace at her, if he doesn't say anything to her about it, then all her vows shall stand, and every bond wherewith she hath bound her soul shall stand. So obviously this chapter is talking about keeping your word, your promises, your vows unto God. If a man vow a vow is a religious promise made to God. Vows were of several kinds. Number one, of abstinence or humiliation, of the Nazirite vow. Number three, of giving certain things or sacrifices to the Lord. Or number four, of alms given to the poor. But this chapter is mainly dealing with that of a woman's vow, because there are four types of women being addressed right here. Number one, the young, unmarried, living in her father's house. Number two, the unmarried during her vow, but is betrothed or married before the vow is completed. Number three, a widow or a divorced woman. Number four, a married woman. Well, if it be asked why sons are not mentioned as well as daughters, since both in their younger years are under the power of their parents, the answer is that the cases are quite different. For the sons may soon have it in their power, when become masters of families, to perform the vows which they had made in their minority. But daughters who pass from the father's jurisdiction into the power of a husband are perpetually dependent, either upon their fathers or husbands, and so have no right to make vows without the consent either of the one or the other, except in the case of widowhood or divorce, which is specified in Numbers 39. Now, such things are going to be very strange for the women of our day. But back then, you have to keep in your mind how this was a brand new nation. They didn't have the kind of hundreds of years of, welfare and social services set up as we do today. So this was much more family-oriented, more than just dependence upon some government or whatever, which I think is a hindrance to society for the most part anyway. I do believe that the family unit is more important. But anyway, but if her father disallow her in the day that he heareth, not any of her vows or of her bonds wherewith she hath bound her soul shall stand, and the Lord shall forgive her, because her father disallowed her. And if you ask me, that seems very normal. What if the father disagreed with one of her vows that she made? Let's say that she wanted to fast for a week or so, and her father said, "No, honey," he says, you're not healthy enough to do that, so just don't do that, okay? Serve the Lord in some other manner. But that doesn't seem very foreign to me. That just seems like honoring your father and mother. And if she had at all a husband, when she vowed or uttered aught out of her lips, wherewith she bound her soul, and her husband heard it, and held his peace at her in the day that he heard it, then her vows shall stand, and her bonds wherewith she bound her soul shall stand. But if her husband disallowed her on the day that he heard it, then he shall make her vow which she vowed, and that which she uttered with her lips, wherewith she bound her soul, of none effect, and the Lord shall forgive her. Because the husband, once again, is representative of Christ and the church. But every vow of a widow, and of her that is divorced, wherewith they have bound their souls, shall stand against her. And if she vowed in her husband's house, or bound her soul by a bond with an oath, and her husband heard it, and held his peace at her, and disallowed her not, then all her vows shall stand, and every bond wherewith she bound her soul shall stand. But if her husband hath utterly made them void on the day he heard them, then whatsoever proceedeth out of her lips concerning her vows or concerning the bond of her soul shall not stand. Her husband hath made them void, and the Lord shall forgive her. Every vow and every binding oath to afflict the soul, her husband may establish it, or her husband may make it void. But if her husband altogether hold his peace at her from day to day, Then he establisheth all her vows, or all her bonds which are upon her. He confirmeth them, because he held his peace at her in the day that he heard them. Now, from day to day probably means within the first 48 hours, after he's given a little bit of time to think about her vows. And I do suppose that an example of this could be that a woman says that she's going to give so much to the poor for a month. And let's just say that they fall into some kind of catastrophe happens. Their cattle are killed by some wild animal or something, and they fall into some kind of financial distress. And the woman has made that vow and she wants to keep it. So the concern is brought up to the husband, and the husband says, honey, we can't afford that right now. Perhaps later we can give the amount that you have promised. So it's one of these in which it's not so judicial. You must look at this in a very normal setting in order to fully grasp what's going on, instead of being like judge, jury, and executioner. I mean, because we know these things that's not the normal mode of marriage. But if the husband shall in any way make them void after that he had heard them, then he shall bear her iniquity. In essence, saying that if he tacitly allowed the vow in the first instance, from day to day, and afterwards forbade its fulfillment, the guilt which such breach of promise involved should rest upon him and not on her. These are the statutes which the Lord commanded Moses between a man and his wife, between the father and his daughter, being yet in her youth in her father's house.